The new Piet borders at RHS Wisley in Surrey are a real lesson in planting design. And whether you've got a large garden or a small space, there are ideas and techniques that actually will make sense whether you're a home gardener or a professional gardener. It's Alexandra here from the Middlesized Garden YouTube channel and blog. And the Oudolf borders, strictly speaking called the Oudolf Landscape, stretch up a hill from their magnificent glass houses. As you approach them, you'll see a board which tells you that these are planted up in Piet Oudolf's signature style, which is a mix of block planting and matrix planting. And this is called naturalistic planting. It means planting plants together in roughly the way that they would appear in nature. It's also very useful because it means that you've got plants working together that grow at different levels, for example. For instance, grasses have quite shallow roots, perennials have quite deep roots. So they're not competing as much as you might think. And what you get is a very dense planting that means you get fewer weeds because there's no soil for the weeds to grow. And that, of course, makes naturalistic planting easier to look after. Choose plants that naturally grow well in your climate or soil. And put plants that need similar kinds of care and like similar kinds of conditions together, which also means you won't have to do the kind of fiddly watering and pruning and fertilising of individual plants that you do for a herbaceous border. So all of this makes naturalistic planting really quite easy care, but it's not rewilding, it's not letting things go. It is really quite different to that. And if you want to know more about rewilding, I'll put a video on that in the description below. It's also very wildlife friendly and sustainable, but you can be wildlife friendly and sustainable without actually having to do naturalistic planting. However, it's a very quick way of getting a beautiful border quickly, because I visited the RHS borders at Wisley only 6 months after they'd been planted from bare soil, and they were magnificent. There are a few little bare patches where some of the grasses will grow to fill in the space, so next year will be even better. But nevertheless, to go from absolutely nothing to this show in 6 months is fabulous. But let's have a look at what naturalistic planting actually is. Piet Oudolf and Noel Kingsley have written a book called Planting a New Perspective, which has been around for quite a few years now. I bought it back in 2014. But in it, they say that naturalistic planting is, and I will read this out to you, an artistically stylised version of natural habitats. So that means that not only do you choose plants that grow well in your soil and climate, but you plant them in ways that you might see if you saw them in nature. Many keen gardeners say that one of the best ways to understand how plants grow in your garden is to see how they grow in the wild. And when I'm walking along the marshes with the dogs, I quite often see grasses and think, oh gosh, that looks very Piet Oudolf. And recently I went to Vermont and my sister-in-law has let her field turn completely natural. All she does is mow a lawn path through it. And it's full of wild asters, showy goldenrod and Joe Pyeweed eupatorium, all of which are seen in naturalistic plantings in borders around the world. And it's completely fabulous. It looks slightly planted, I have to say. So this block planting and matrix planting, what is it? What's the difference? Of course, the block planting is very easy. Piet Oudolf and Noel Kingsley say that it's really just a big block of plants, not surprisingly. And it's traditionally been used in parks, and that's because it has advantages and disadvantages. The main advantages are that it's very easy to spot weeds. So, an inexperienced gardener or even just a helper can weed it out, which is one of the reasons why you see so much block planting in municipal parks. And also, of course, because it's all one plant, it's got all one care regime. So once again, very easy for a head gardener to tell a junior gardener, just deal with that block over there. But of course, Noel Kingsley says it's quite old-fashioned. That kind of block planting in parks is old-fashioned. I spoke to Ian Trout, who's a horticulturalist at the Oudolf Landscape in Wisley, and he said that the reason for block planting in a large area is that it creates the colour impact you need. You really aren't going to get the really big impact if you just have lots of different flowers next to each other. Big blocks of flowers repeated, as in the Wisley landscape, are essential if you want to create an impact in a big area. Ian Trout, however, does say that block planting isn't really suitable for smaller gardens. And that's because you'd have a great big block of something. It would be gorgeous for 6 weeks, 2 months maybe at most. And then the rest of the time you're not really looking at very much. So block planting is better for big gardens rather than small gardens. There are quite a lot of different definitions of matrix planting, however, but Kingsley and Oudolf describe it as being like a fruitcake. The cake bit of it is grasses. So you would take one kind of grass and plant it over quite a large area, and then you weave the perennials in through it. Now the perennials can be things like yarrow, Hylotelephium, formerly sedum. They can be asters, they can be solidago, they can be rudbeckia, helenium, echinacea, all these lovely plants. There are several different kinds of grasses used as matrices in the RHS borders. And then you get the flowers that are planted between them, which are still in groups, but they're in much smaller groups woven between the matrix. It's what Oudolf would call the fruit and nuts in the fruitcake. One of the advantages of using a matrix, says Ian, is that if a plant doesn't do well, you won't notice it so much because the grass is giving the permanent movement and colour and structure, and then the flowers that come up, if some of them are not doing so well, it won't look as bad. What this means is that when you're doing a naturalistic border, you plant the grasses first, and it's not the only kind of border where grasses are planted first. When I spoke to Paul Seaborn of Pelham Plants, who has a cottage garden, he says that if he was starting a border from scratch, he would start with grasses because they add so much structure to a garden. So you start with the grasses, you weave the flowers through them. Thus far, matrix planting makes sense. But the biggest change at RHS Wisley with the Oudolf Landscape is the way they've tackled the hill. And if you've got any sort of a slope in your garden at all, I think this is really an interesting way of treating a sloping garden. Now, there were Oudolf borders for about 20 years at Wisley, and they were completely different. There was a wide grass path that went right from the bottom of the hill where the glasshouses are, up the hill, and the borders were on either side. And you could walk up the hill and look at the borders on either side, and then get to the top of the hill and look down. However, there were practical problems with this kind of design. And Ian Trout told me that the problem was that water rushes down a hill. So it rushed down the grass path. Obviously, people would come up to see the Oudolf borders, particularly in autumn when there's an awful lot of rain. The whole thing would turn into a mud bath and have to be closed. What they've done now is that they've done borders that snake from side to side, a very gradual trip up the hill. It deals much better with the business of the rain because the water no longer pours straight down a path. It's stopped. They put drainage in. It's a hard path and they put drainage in. So the water is drained away, and it's also stopped by having all the various different levels. It's much easier to walk up than a steep, straight path. It's much more wheelchair and wheelbarrow friendly, and if you've got any size of hill, I think it's worth thinking about because obviously it is more accessible for wheelchairs and wheelbarrows than steps are and terracing. And of course the great advantage of a hill is that it shows off planting really well. So you've got the slope. In naturalistic planting, you don't have big at the back, small in the middle, even smaller at the front. You have pretty much the same heights going through, and of course a slope makes that look fantastic. But there's also a sort of emotional side to having this path that goes up the hill, and Piet Oudolf said that what it means is that you're slowed down, you go more slowly, you're more immersed in the planting, and that makes it a much more peaceful journey. And if you look at people coming through the planting, it seems as if they're walking right through the borders. They're surrounded by the plants. And there's a lovely friendly bench on almost every level, so you can sit down and just enjoy that level of planting. So you're immersed in the planting all the way up the hill and all the way down again, as well as being able to look at it from lots of different angles. So I think if you've got any kind of slope in your garden, that is really worth thinking about. Although obviously once again you'd need a bit of size and space if you were going to do this side to side thing. The thing to really stress is that it's repetition and contrast that make the most of these naturalistic borders. You can see, if you look at the slopes, that the same plants are repeated in large groups or smaller groups, sometimes a large group, sometimes weaving through in the matrix. the heleniums, the rudbeckias, the hylotelephiums, the asters, the echinaceas. They're repeated again and again. The colours are repeated again and again. There are only 155 plants in this whole really quite large area. And then the next thing that really makes it work is the contrast. There's the soft planting but the hard path with its very sharp edges. But it's also the architectural contrast of the plants that's really important. You've got the sharp spikes of the festuca, the grasses. You've got the soft mounds of the asters. You've got the slightly harder, stronger mounds, the cloud-like mounds of the hylotelephium. And the plants are chosen to contrast in their whole shape. Ian Trout says that at the back of planting a new perspective, which he also recommends, is that there's a great list of the plants most commonly used in, say, a Piet Oudolf borders or a Piet Oudolf landscape. And it has their flowering period and their colour and their names and how many plants per square inch and when they flower. But it also lists the plants according to their structural interest, and that is a very interesting way of looking at them. So whether you've got a small garden or a large one, I do think it's important to think about the structure and the architecture of the plants, not just when they're in flower and what colour the flower is. Another thing about these naturalistic borders is that they are not chopped down at the end of summer. They're at their best in summer and late summer, and then during the winter the structure of the plants is left, and because they're chosen with contrasting structure there is still quite a lot to look at. But obviously the birds and the wildlife use it for shelter, the birds may eat the seed heads, and slowly they break down and they are not cleared away at RHS Wisley, according to Ian Trout, until the end of February. So the fact that you don't have to cut down any of the vegetation until late February, when a lot of it will have collapsed anyway, does mean that naturalistic borders are very easy to maintain, and you shouldn't really have to do much watering. In the first year of a new border, new plants may need watering during the summer to get established if there's not much rain, but otherwise, if you're choosing the right plants, you should be able to have a border that doesn't need watering. We're getting in the UK very dry summers, very wet winters at the moment, so we need quite resilient plants that will deal with both drought and wet, and I have got a video about resilient plants which I'll put in the description below. But if you want to see naturalistic planting working beautifully in a much smaller area, Michael McCoy has designed this wonderful naturalistic garden in this video coming up next, which is called Naturalistic Planting: How to Make It Work in Your Garden. And thank you for watching. Goodbye.